Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. One thing I had a memory of that I'd like to share with the listeners was a particular television show that I enjoyed during the 1970s as I was growing up. And that show was a hit TV series, Kung Fu, starring David Carradine. This was a story about a young man who, as a boy, decided to enter the Shaolin priesthood to discover how he could actually go about finding and being in the world that he was walking into. And so there was a particular episode that I remember where he was standing there on the banks. There was a particular scene that was playing out. And as he stood by the Shaolin priest, he was listening to the accounts of the other young Shaolin monks who were being trained and realized with confusion that they were each giving a different account of what actually happened. By the end of it all, he said to his master, "I don't understand. This is what actually happened here." And he says, "But is it really?" So the question comes that when you go and you perceive something, or when you experience something in your life, do you really experience the reality of what it was, or is there a way that you astonishingly reinterpret the events that you experience? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book Perceptual Intelligence. It's Dr. Brian Boxer-Walter who's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, who's going to help us define perceptual intelligence to help us understand how we interpret and occasionally manipulate our experiences to distinguish fantasy from reality. Dr. Brian, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
My pleasure to be with you. My pleasure.
Now, just a shout out to the listeners out there. They have to get this because this book is a hell of a lot of fun to read. You know, and being in media for many, many years, there's a lot of things that I have studied over the years where it's funny when you get to the other side of the mirror, as I like to call it, you begin to see the illusion that, for instance, media and entertainment create, but how real a lot of us think that what we see is. Now, the first question I have to ask, since we're talking about perception, is how did you become an expert in perceptual intelligence?
I have to take you back to when I was in 6th grade in my elementary school, and I was flipping through and I was looking at the books, and I was in the library, and I secretly checked out Judy Blume's classic, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And I was just curious how the mind of the opposite sex works. And so I always had this fascination with our psychology and how the brain works and our mind works. And then fast forward, I'm in college. I was a psychology and a biology major to further understand that. And then I always wanted to be a doctor and particularly a surgeon. So I went in that direction with my medical studies and became an ophthalmologist. And at a later date was in 2014, I was in Sochi, Russia, and this is where the real trigger for the book occurred. And I was there to support my patient and dear friend, Stephen Holcomb, who was the U.S. Olympic gold medal bobsled driver. He won a gold medal in 2010 in bobsled in Vancouver, and he had an eye disease because I eventually became a pioneer in treatments for an eye disease called keratoconus, where the cornea bulges out and causes a lot of distortions. Well, Stephen had this disease, and I had developed these procedures, one even named after him now, called Holcomb C3R, after he won gold. And I was there at the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, Russia, to support him, and that's where I was witnessing Vladimir Putin and how he was giving the world a certain impression of him versus what he was really like and what he was really doing. And that's where I saw this really big and deep disconnect between perception and reality. And that's when I started really doing a deep dive into this area and started writing actually during my trip in Sochi when I was there. And that's the genesis for the book.
Well, speaking of Vladimir Putin, let's go ahead and talk about him for a minute, especially when it comes to a Super Bowl ring. Now, I thought that was a funny story, and I'll tell you why. We had the opportunity, and we spent a good hour with the guest that we brought on, and he had a book that he had put out, How to Negotiate Anything. Now, this was the guy that was actually involved, and he goes way back in negotiations, top-level aid for the United States government. He was involved in trying to negotiate the hostages out of Iran during the Carter administration. This is how big and how far back this guy goes. And one of the things he talks about, he actually dedicates pretty much a good sizable chapter to how the Russians negotiate. They basically just wear you down, So let's go ahead and talk about that particular incident that you share in the book about this Super Bowl ring here, to give people an idea of what you're talking about.
Certainly, and we talk about what you're referring to is this unbelievable episode that happened when the New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft was over visiting Putin in Russia. And, Putin has such an unbelievable, distorted sense of reality of the world and of himself that he asks Kraft, hey, can I just check out your Super Bowl ring that's on his finger? And he takes it off and he shows it to him, and Putin admires it. And then he just pockets it and starts to walk off. And Kraft's like, a little boy, like he just had his ice cream stolen, kind of going after him. And then these KGB officers, sort of like classic movie type scene, just like block him. And, what's Kraft going to do at that point, So that's where, we see this perception of people, and particularly the whole chapter about Putin, that really stemmed from when I was at the Olympics that, led to this, the book Perceptual Intelligence. And I think we should talk about what is perceptual intelligence, because that's really the underlying crux of the story and a lot of what the book is. And the way I define perceptual intelligence is how we, based on our experiences, how we separate reality from fantasy. And when we can do that, and we know how to do it well, like any type of intelligence, we can get better at it with understanding, insight, and practice. Then we can make better decisions in our lives. And when we can do that, then we can achieve what we want in life, whether it's more success, more happiness, better sex. There's a whole chapter about that too. And just more happiness in life and being able to achieve what you want to achieve. And that's what the book is about helping people get those insights about themselves and other people to be able to make better decisions. They can have what they ultimately want to achieve in life.
And I'm kind of reminded of a guest we had on the program a few years back, and that was Byron Katie, the 4 questions that can change your life. And she just simply asked the one question is, if life got easier for you, would that be okay?
Right. And
you realize that as you rise, you call it your perceptual intelligence quotient, or, going from the low end of the spectrum to the higher end of the spectrum of perceptual intelligence, you realize life does become easier because you're experiencing and seeing reality as it actually is. And therefore you become less frustrated with life, and you become more interested and engaged in it, I would think.
And that's really an important comment you just made, because now more than ever before, we are exposed to so much information constantly. Our perception and our senses are just overloaded. And when people feel out of control, that's when people can start to feel depressed and anxiety and stress. And studies have shown that there was one study that if someone was listening to loud music while they were trying to read, this was a study, and one group was able to change the volume, the group that was able to change the volume, because they had control, they had much less anxiety. And that's a little bit about what having perceptual intelligence allows people to do, is empower people and really have control over what you're being exposed to. Otherwise, you're just at the end of a train, that caboose being whipped along. And so when you're reading things on your social media, you're reading things on the internet, people are talking to you, you're watching TV, you're listening to radio. When you have this filter that's really finely tuned, you have critical thinking skills that are very developed, and which is another foundation of having this power of really high perceptual intelligence. And then you can separate, what is coming at you, what's real and what's fake, and what's real news, what's fake news, for example. And it's very empowering, and that's, like you said, it makes life a lot more simple now when you have that ability versus just believing everything that you read, even though it sounds good and, in fact, may be appealing to your emotions, your cultural background, your religion. These are all factors that bias how we tend to think about what we are receiving in our perceptions. And having the insights about those biases helps you get to the truth, and that's ultimately where you can have more decision making and better happiness, because you understand what's real and what's not real.
Now, as you began to study this, long before you were putting together your book, Perceptual Intelligence, how did you discover how our brain actually works when it comes to interpreting, I suppose, a reality, if you will?
The brain is like a muscle. And I remember my first psychology class, I was a freshman at UCLA, and it was a study about how this, at a university, they always tend to pick college students for these experiments, but they had a group of them where...
Well, that's because they have such great life experience. And we'll get more on the education level and cults later on, because I know people will be surprised about that one. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, for sure. But, the power of how our brain affects things and what we perceive is they had these college students put on glasses that had prisms and mirrors that flipped everything they saw in the world upside down. And you can imagine trying to walk to class and go about your day with everything upside down. It's pretty disturbing. But then after a couple of days, they perceived everything to be right side up again. So the brain was showing that it's able to make these adjustments. And if you think of a muscle when you work out at the gym and do weight training, it's going to get stronger and bigger. It adapts. The brain is just like that too. And that's where psychology and perception comes in, because you can have a lot of control over what your brain and mind are doing, and that's really the foundation.
Now, let's go ahead and talk about that for a moment, education and cults, because I think people will be surprised that people generally who get into the fold of a cult, if you will, tend to not be these people that lack education. In fact, I think the more educated they are, the more they're able to rationalize a so-called intelligent reason why they get involved in something that to others may seem rather irrational.
And that's a great point. There's a really well-publicized example of even a woman who was a valedictorian in high school, and she was in a cult, and she finally broke out and talked about her experience there. But emotion and emotional fragility, or just being in a funk, has nothing to do with how smart you are in your education and what you scored in your SATs and how well you did in college and your GPA. I mean, you can have somebody who looks on paper like the perfect stellar type, person, but yet finds themselves in the situation of being brainwashed in a cult. And the reason is because when we boil it down, and the chapter on this is so powerful, because it's like, opening the kimono to what a lot of people don't really understand and know. But what it explains is that people, when they are lacking even a period in life, love and emotional connection with other people or their family. That's why a lot of times when students move to a new college in a new city where they don't have friends yet, cults know that there's this window. If they give unconditional love and attention to somebody, then that's how they can make that connection and draw them in, like suck them in. And, you have to think of it as cults don't come around to somebody with a big sign, the sandwich sign saying, I'm in a cult, come join us. they don't do that at all. Nobody in the beginning even knows that it's a cult. It's more like, oh, hey, what's your name? You're new to town? Yeah, great. Oh, my name's so-and-so. What are you doing? Hey, you want to come over for dinner with a couple friends? And that's classic the way this starts. So it's not even declared, so to speak, that they're from a cult. And these people are trained by the cult in order to how to precisely execute this plan so they can bring people in like this slowly. It's like sinking the claws in. And any parent listening right now, don't for a moment think, oh, there's no way my child could ever, be in a cult. Virtually, every parent will think that whose child was in a cult.
Right.
And as long as they have good emotional support from their family, most importantly, and also from friends, that helps make them bulletproof against what the cults provide, which is that unconditional love to draw them in.
Well, and another point on that, too, as we're going down the cult alley, if you will, is that you may also be this child that's raised in a family with very good discipline and structure, which are very good keystone elements for, how you conduct yourself later in life and what you're able to do. And the beauty of the way a cult works in a situation like that is the child may decide, which most of us do, we get to a point where we say, but I'd like my own identity and see if I can kind of do things on my own. And when you unfold into the possibility of getting involved in a cult, you have this false sense of unconditional love and support that says, we want you to be you. And you can see how you can be ensnared in just that illusion alone. And that's a tricky one, because most people may think that people who get involved in cults, which is fairly true as well, is that they get to a point where there's no emotional support or they feel weak. For instance, a great example is in the movie American History X. I don't know if you remember that movie or not, but it's one where a young man, a teenage man, his father is slain by blacks, and he was, emotionally weak from the whole situation. This was an intelligent kid, and he gets slowly pulled into sort of a neo-Nazi group, and eventually ends up in prison and realizes that all these choices he had made up to that point were rather stupid because he was emotionally weak. It's pretty amazing how that works.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily like being chronically emotionally weak. It could be somebody's just in a funk. They're having an episode, like you just described in the film. His parent died, so there's this like period of being vulnerable. A lot of times, it's not like somebody who's chronically in that stage. It's just they have these episodes of being vulnerable, and there's certain things, times in lives, like when people move to a new city where they don't have friends yet. These are some of these classic periods, and cults are much bigger. It's not just Dianetics and the Church of Scientology. There's lots and lots of cults that just aren't in the news that are out there that are flying below the radar.
And I found it comical when you wrote about Scientology to realize that I didn't know this, not that I looked a whole deeply a lot at Scientology, but the idea that L. Ron Hubbard somehow had brought billions of human beings to planet Earth. Really?
That's what that's what Dianetics describes.
Wow.
In a period of time when human beings didn't exist, and that's pretty well shown, by anthropologists. So, originally he was a science fiction writer. So it's not unexpected that something like this might come from a mind of a science fiction writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're having some fun with this, too, as I alluded to earlier, when it came to media and how a lot of times we'll see, if it's on the television, it must be true. If you heard it on the radio, it must be reality. If you read it in a newspaper, God forbid, there it is, static in print. That must be true. And when you think about, for instance, the settling of the Wild Wild West, you realize just how powerful the newspaper print was at creating a lot of personas that may not be as big as we had perceived it to be as we read about it. For instance, we just visited the town of Tombstone, Arizona. You go there, the town seems a lot bigger than what it actually is once you're there.
Because your perception of what you've, maybe seen in movies or read in, print gives your mind this impression that it's much bigger than obviously what you experienced when you got there. You're probably like, oh, this is the town.
Exactly. Still a lot of fun, though. But here's the thing. How do we decide, or where's the thinking process that television or the like actually automatically raises somebody's integrity, if you will, to different levels? To give you an idea, I could stand there and I could tell you about the right way to eat, so that you'll lose weight and you'll feel better. And it's something any of us can read in any book in a library and go and pass that information on. Now, if I stand there and I'm a stranger and I talk to you about this, most likely you're going to brush me off. Well, what does this guy know? But if I turn around and I go behind a camera and you see me on television, all of a sudden my integrity and expertise has just raised several points. What's going on there?
And that's because of a phenomenon called the halo effect. So when you see somebody on TV, we've all seen programs, subconsciously we associate, if somebody's on TV, they are, number one, a celebrity to some degree, just being on TV, and there's a lot of people watching, and to be on TV is really hard, subconsciously, right? We know that. So there were people who are behind the scenes that trusted and put this person in a position where they have the rare honor of being on TV. So when you see somebody on TV giving information, you immediately associate them with being a celebrity to some degree and also having authority, opinion. And so that gives the halo effect. And that's also why when celebrities are giving information, they also have the halo effect too, and they may be speaking in areas that are completely out of what they're even looked up to for, which is
such as Kim Kardashian trying to put out her own credit card.
Exactly. And social media is an extension of the halo effect that you see in TV and in films. But there was a really great example we discuss in talking about marketing with celebrities and the halo effect is Jamie Lee Curtis used to do commercials for this yogurt called Activia.
I remember those, yes.
Yeah, and they were all over, and the claim of improved digestion turned out to be false. But because it was Jamie Lee Curtis and she's a trusted celebrity, a lot of people ran out and bought that yogurt expecting to have the benefit of improved digestion when it was later determined by the FTC that was a false advertising claim. So here we had a celebrity and a company together hijack the perceptual intelligence of a lot of people who went out to expect a benefit, but in fact there really wasn't any. So, it's important to do your research when it comes to these types of things where you might be swayed because of the halo effect. And it's not just in that. I mean, you look at Bernie Madoff, who is now in prison because of his Ponzi scheme with financial investing. And there were a lot of people who got taken in because, he had great credentials, and there were lots of people who were singing his praises who had done very well financially. But again, his halo effect suckered in people who were among the most educated and most famous, including Steven Spielberg, to the old retirees, and their whole retirement savings has just been swindled away, and everybody in between.
Same thing with the Enron Corporation and World.com. So it was,
right.
And it's funny to think about that because many years ago, as I first broke into radio, there was a lady that put out a book called The Energy of Money. And she talked about that very thing. She says, look, I was college educated. I was a psychologist, for crying out loud, with a thriving practice. Somebody comes along and they make me this offer, and she says, this is why I wrote this book. She says, because I decided to get to the truth of why I made the choice that lost me more than $15,000. She says it was just this simple. Now, this is something that our listeners need to pay attention to. I was motivated by the choice that I made through greed, the allure of easy money without a lot of effort. How often do we buy into that? I mean, that's how Las Vegas was built, for crying out loud. But, that's an interesting phenomenon in and of itself, because I do remember, and I'm sure you might be familiar with those too, about the $1 bidding experiment, where they put out $1 and people get to start with a penny to bid on getting $1. And before you know it, the winner actually ends up paying $5 for a $1 bill. So let's talk about the thinking behind that.
Well, it's pretty general, that concept that obviously people want to, do well financially, and that's an emotional drive. And so when you have these opportunities, which may be legitimate or maybe not, people are already predisposed to want to believe it, and that's what's driving a lot of that behavior between people, with people who do get snookered and swindled and taken advantage of financially. I mean, even right now, as we're talking, there's a huge story that's blowing up in the news about the company Theranos with Elizabeth Holmes, who is charged with a massive fraud scheme about the blood testing. Have you kind of
Yeah, I am familiar with that company. I remember that started about 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Huge, they became huge. I believe Walgreens was carrying their blood tests in the pharmacies. You're supposed to get an incredible amount of data, lab data, out of just a couple of drops of blood. And, I think one of the investors, the way this broke, is one of the investors went in for blood tests, and they took a whole tube of blood. And he was like, well, I thought you're supposed to, for this Theranos test, just supposed to get a couple drops. And they didn't, and they just got a huge tube, normal tube. And that's what triggered him. And it turned out, she, again, because of ethics issues and greed, presumably took advantage and lied and misrepresented what her products and lab tests were doing in order to, make a lot of money. And, with power comes responsibility. And that's where a number of people, I would say, cross that line. And investors have to always be aware and do their due diligence, and trust but verify.
Right. And Dr. Brian, you bring up a very valid point. Certainly we've brought a lot of experts on this program over the years, especially when it comes to things such as health and exercise. And the one thing I constantly talk about, and I keep saying over and over, but do your homework. So just because you heard it here doesn't mean it's the end. Do your homework. Find out more about what we're talking about. This should be what opens your eyes. And do your homework. And now, back to Jamie Lee Curtis and this lady that you were just talking about now. You bring up something I find that really needs to be addressed, and when you were talking about power, and that is the media itself and the responsibility they have for what they put out there now. As you were talking about Jamie Lee Curtis and Activia, I was thinking back to when Tom Cruise got in that heated argument with Matt Lauer, okay? And it was over psychology and psychotropic drugs, and it had to do, I believe, with a Brooke Shields coming on and talking about a particular drug she was using to basically help her balance her postpartum depression, having a baby. Mm-hmm. So here they're bringing her on, and she's talking about how great this is and what upset Cruise. And it was funny how it was played out that Cruise seemed to be the bad guy, but I actually went on YouTube finally, and this was a good couple of years later, to see, okay, what actually happened here? And what Tom Cruise was saying, when you really pay attention, was really quite on the money. He says, look, you guys are responsible for influencing a lot of people. And you really don't know when it came to this particular drug, and we really don't know how powerful psychotropic drugs really are and what they actually do when it comes to the brain, the long-term effects. But you're out spouting this stuff on, because of this situation, and you really don't know the consequences that if people follow what you're putting out there, what could happen. And I thought, this guy should have been applauded more than being attacked, because it was perceived that he was attacking Matt Lauer. And I was thinking, how often these day shows actually do things like that? They just kind of put it out there, and people just mindlessly go about saying, it must be true, so I'm going to do it, without realizing the consequences.
Well, sure, and I think he was, it sounds like from what you just described, he was providing a little bit of a, check and balance, because if Brooke Shields is, talking about her experience with a certain drug, you bet there's a lot of people who probably went out and, and talked to their doctor after the show was over about that drug and having it prescribed potentially.
Yeah, crazy.
And again, that goes back to that halo effect.
Right, exactly. So, how do we begin to draw the line on that so we actually begin to say, okay, well, I see this, but, and start questioning that reality so we begin to see it clearer?
Well, the book really shows people and takes people by the hand down to understanding your own internal biases and what might be driving emotions internally that makes you predisposed to certain types of messaging that you're exposed to. And once you know that, then you can, number one, recognize and have insight. Without insight, then you're a goner. You have to have insight about yourself regarding this. And then when you do, then you can learn how to think critically. And the book goes through that. It even has a really nice quiz at the end, a self-test, to test your own perceptual intelligence at the end of the book. And it gives you those tools to approach things with a critical eye and what to do regarding whether it's on TV or internet or you're reading about it, or it comes through your email from somebody or your social media feed. And so then you have a stronger sense of control, and it's sort of like, having, Jedi Knight, level perceptual intelligence, when you get through the end of it, to be able to have better decision making. So you can avoid making things that might be costly financially or even with your health. A lot of times, people might be taking things that they read about as a new treatment for something without really looking into it. And sometimes those things can have adverse consequences. Or even if you have, there's a chapter about people with chronic medical conditions like cancer, how can you approach that to be able to still lead a very successful and thriving life with a chronic disease? So there's, the other side of the spectrum, we've been mostly talking about the critical thinking part of perceptual intelligence. Then there's the other side of the spectrum about it, which is more in the metaphysical, like your intuition and your gut feelings, which is the opposite side of critical thinking, and it's listening to your gut and your intuition. And we talk about what's the science behind that, what's the validity of that, and how do you do that better.
And another thing we can also bring into this, because you're talking about metaphysics and how we can actually enhance our ability to be intuitive and make more intuitive decisions, which you talk about being a lot more accurate. You were describing a story where you were in a station wagon, for instance.
Yeah, so I've always, listened to my gut feeling from a young age, and, I credit one time to at least preventing me from getting seriously injured, possibly even saving my life. I was coming back with a group of friends. We were on the debate team at UCLA. We were coming back from a tournament up in Northern California, and we're speeding away on the freeway. We're all packed into a station wagon that was our debate vehicle. And I always wore my seatbelt, always. And the seatbelts in the station wagon, they were those bench seats, and they were sort of stuck way deep down in between the seats, and it was just too hard to get to, so I wasn't wearing my seatbelt when we were going down the freeway. And then just suddenly this idea hit me, it came to me of, wear your seatbelt. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to start now digging out and like excavating to get those, seatbelts, and I finally got it, I clicked it. And then literally about 30 seconds later, suddenly we blow a tire, and the whole station wagon with all of us, college kids start spinning around out of control, and it just like eventually went off the road into like a soft ditch with grass. And had I not been wearing my seatbelt, I would have been spun around at least like loose change in a dryer, but at worst I would have been probably ejected from the window. And that was my gut feeling that I listened to that led me to put that seatbelt on. Just seems at the right time.
Yeah, I found that to be really fascinating because it also made me start thinking about dreams and dream work. And that was certainly an area I explored some years ago, especially in the 90s, because I think I started becoming a lucid dreamer by the time I was 6 years old. And over the years, as you develop this and as you're really becoming more enhanced about remembering the dreams, being more of a co-participant to a point that you're a creator of what's actually happening in the dream world, you begin to notice some very subtly interesting things that happen in this reality, if you will. For instance, that you have a certain level of psychic ability, although it doesn't seem intentional, but you'll find yourself with a flash of insight, you spew it out of your mouth, and you'll see somebody stand there astounded like, how did you know that? It's like, well, I didn't. It was just sort of like this flash came to me, and I said it. It was more from left field for me than it was an accurate prediction. But, let's talk about that a little bit, especially when it comes to, your gut feeling, intuition, or what you experience in a dream, and you go into reality and you realize this has this feeling like this has happened before or it's about to happen.
Exactly. And, one thing we aren't quite sure of, science has a lot of great tools, but it still doesn't have the tools to be able to diagnose or detect, measure where this is coming from. So we don't know if these thoughts, first of all, are percolating and bubbling up from our subconscious when we're sleeping or when we're awake and we just have a thought pop into our head, or if it's being put in there by some external being, energy level, call it guardian angel or other, higher level of intelligence. We don't know, but what we do know is when those thoughts do come to you, whether it's when you're sleeping or when you're awake, more often than not, the science that evaluates this shows and bears out that those are thoughts that are the right indicators for the direction to go or making decisions based on. Not all the time, but a lot of times. So the take-home message there is, and the book goes through some wonderful examples to help people really understand how to better be in touch with their own intuition, because it's not something that gets traditionally taught in school, and parents usually don't discuss this with their children. So the book helps to fill that void for people to empower them in this area. But when you do have these ideas, then you want to pay attention to them and evaluate them. Doesn't mean you act on every one you get, but at least you should not just discard it as a knee-jerk reaction.
Or being impulsive. And there's a funny chapter all by itself when we talk about how impulsive we can become, especially when we get into what you had termed the felony spending habits of being on vacation. Let's talk about that, because I'll tell you, being in Tombstone recently, it was funny because years ago I probably would have came back with a whole armful of stuff. My first time, here, so I should celebrate grabbing this thing because it's the first time I'm in a place like Tombstone, or, it could be the Grand Canyon, for instance. As you can tell, we just recently moved to Arizona. But anyway, the thing is I found that, no, I wanted something unique to come at me. There was, and that didn't happen. It just, to me, it was like, well, you can do tourism and do tourism shops anywhere. But let's talk about why people tend to be what I would consider to be overly impulsive, especially when it comes to being on vacation.
In vacation, it's a happy time, right? You're away, you're in a new place, you're with people you like, and you're seeing knickknacks and tchotchkes, and you're feeling like you want a piece of what you're experiencing and to take home. And so so that's usually why people buy things, or they may, pocket the towels in the hotel, for example, because you want to have a piece of it, and you're just feeling in the mood, and you're impulsive in that way. The problem is when you come home and then you start putting these things on a shelf or setting them up somewhere, is as you collect them, you start to then eventually look at them, and you're like, this really, number one, doesn't even go with like what my home is, and a lot of times kind of become a bit of eyesores. And people, it's a little bit like buyer's remorse. A lot of times that settles in after a while. So like having that multicolored sand that you got when you were at some tropical vacation that's in the glass, at home kind of loses its sparkle, pretty quickly. And especially when you have lots of these different things, then you start to realize, maybe I was just, perhaps having this episode of low perceptual intelligence, if you will, while you're having a great time when you're on vacation.
See, because the other way that I thought about it, too, is that let's say that you're somebody who could be perceived by friends or relations as not going out and doing very much, and then you finally go on this phenomenal vacation and you buy things to bring back so that you have a story and you become interesting. Would that be also a motivating factor as well?
It could be. I mean, people do things frequently for good conversation, in a dinner party, for example, with friends, to be able to say that I did this and, I had this experience. So they do have a story. But you can still have stories, if you really think about it, without having to, purchase, really unnecessary things. A lot of vacations and destinations now are focused really on experiential vacations. So, it's the experience of doing something. It's not necessarily the object. And having a great experience, if you want to have a great story to spin, with your friends and family when you get back home, is certainly right there for you, because you've got the experience to tell that story. But you don't have to go buy the tchotchkes that are associated with it, and getting the T-shirt and getting the snow globes. And although, mind you, my daughter loves snow globes. So.
Yeah, or the small Statue of Liberty. Well, in fact, here's one. It was funny. We were visiting a place, and I had actually found in their gift shop, they had this keychain, but it had a cube on it that actually represented where you got this keychain from. And it was a place in just outside of Sedona called Montezuma's Castle. Fascinating place to visit. And I just personally liked the keychain. I'd never seen one that had a little cube on it. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, then we went out and we visited this crater, and my wife says, well, look, they got a keychain with a little cube that represents the crater that we're at here. And that's when it hit me, and I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting collection, that if we go from place to place, let's look for those little cube keychains rather than those spoons people like to collect. Mm-hmm. And it kind of gives you the idea, well, a keychain gives you the, that you actually traveled there to go get it. And it's a small trinket, and they're like $5, and they're kind of cool, actually, because you don't usually see cube keychains. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine what it would be like standing on the corner in Winslow, Arizona, where we just couldn't find the cube keychain. Now, one phenomenon I know you talked about in here, too, was that of collection and collectibles. And I found that to be a great chapter, because we had actually had a guest on the program that was talking about being able to evaluate collections and art, what goes behind all that. It's really not as complicated, but it's as it sounds, but it's certainly one that takes due diligence and homework. But it was a wonderful segment we did. But what I wanted to talk about was, you talk about Beanie Babies. And I was listening to a segment on Coast to Coast AM where they had this guy come on and was talking about the Beanie Baby phenomenon. Now, with collectibles, when you see collections, you're thinking, man, that's kind of cool. Like a friend of mine had these Slurpee cups when the first American Dream Team basketball team was created. Until you've seen a collection of all of the team members in the 7-Eleven Slurpee cups, you didn't think much about it, but he had 2 complete sets. But you think about, for instance, like the Beanie Baby and the collection of something that is allegedly rare, and you came to understand that, well, the person that created the Beanie Babies did that. He would do small production runs to create the illusion that these things were rare. Let's talk about why we're motivated that way.
This is a classic way that people's PI, perceptual intelligence, gets overtaken and manipulated.
Goes down the toilet, in other words.
yeah, because psychology will always dictate that when something is rare, it increases demand, right? So when you have a known limited run on a certain product, like Beanie Babies or those Cabbage Patch dolls, then people are concerned that they're going to run out of supply, so they want to get it. And in marketing, there's a very well-known idiom that lack of supply or fear of loss is much more motivating than prospective gain. So in other words, people are afraid of losing out on an opportunity or missing out. That's psychologically more motivating for behavior than the prospect of getting another nice little doll, a Beanie Baby doll to add to your collection, on your bed or on your shelf.
It was like the dollar experiment I was talking about earlier. Pretty soon you're so far in that you're afraid of losing it just because you're so far into it. So.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So, parents and kids in particular, know, there's only going to be so many available. We got to go get it now. And people are selling them and reselling them for multiples of what they bought them for. But it's classic in sales and marketing. This technique. I mean, you look in the papers and you see big sales, full-page ads that are, the sale ends on a certain day.
Right.
Well, that's another way of takeaway selling, if you will, because once the deadline comes, then the sale is over. So that's
my brother actually got caught up into that. He was out to buy a used car, and I was with him. And I already knew that when you think there's a great deal out there, especially if you're not shopping on a lot, chances are you're going to find a better deal if you're patient. He goes out and meets with this guy, and mysteriously another guy happens to just show up who wants to buy that same car. And that's something I've never seen before. And he got to a point where my brother felt that he was about to lose the car, and the guy says to this other guy who was interested, well, I kind of promised this guy I'd sell it to him. And there he was. He was hooked, bait, line, and sinker the whole bit. I was like, dude, just walk away because this guy isn't going to buy this car. This is probably a buddy he just called up.
Yeah, and for sure. And that's another way to illustrate how powerful that is. There was one example when the Poseidon Adventure years ago was for the first time the rights were going to be sold to TV, to air. And they did something which they usually didn't do, is they actually had a bidding war of different networks in the same room that were bidding for the rights to air the Poseidon Adventure movie on TV. And because people were bidding, there were more people, more than one person or group that wanted it. That drove up, because of the fear of loss from each of the parties, that I don't want to miss out on this opportunity. And that's what drove up the price. I mean, so it's a very classic psychological technique to make sales. But when you understand that, it again almost gives you Jedi Knight abilities, when it comes to filtering information and making decisions. So in this case, you don't spend a lot of money unnecessarily.
Well, there's that, and realize that there's always going to be another great deal, or whatever the case is. It's going to come around, and I think one of the classic examples that I like to give on that is the great investor Warren Buffett. And, here's a guy, he became at one point the richest man on planet Earth through investing, okay? So this is somebody who really knows what he's doing. He knows how to do his homework. But yet, to this day, he still gets chastised and basically punished for not investing in Intel. Mm-hmm. That they felt that was one of the stupidest decisions that he's ever made by not doing that. He simply just says, well, I don't invest in technology. A, it's wary, and I just don't understand it. And I won't invest in anything that I don't understand. That's a pretty high perceptual intelligence quotient, I would say. You're going to tell this guy who became the richest guy on planet Earth at one point that he's a lousy investor because he missed out on Intel? Really?
Well, and
Funny
hindsight's always 20/20. I mean,
yeah.
it's always easy to look back and then make judgments.
Right,
Right?
exactly. Whereas in this case here, and it'd be like, I wished I'd gotten involved with Microsoft. You're always hearing that, or Apple computers, but how tech savvy were you when these things were coming out, and how well would you have understood them if you weren't? That's why you didn't get involved in it in the first place. So.
Exactly.
Now, what I'd like to talk about lastly is how you talk about perceptual intelligence, especially when it comes to athletes, your winning teams and your losing teams. I mean, certainly Cleveland finally broke their losing streak when the Cavaliers finally got their championship. But, you know, the difference like in athletes and their perceptual intelligence from being people who lose all the time to those who become super-duper stars like, for instance, Michael Jordan.
You know, certainly for somebody like that, I mean, it's a combination of natural abilities and gifts, and then also what they do to develop them into what they become later. And sports psychologists talk a lot about the concept of visualization, which is how people can improve what they want to achieve, whether, again, it's sports or anything else in life for that matter. But visualization is this technique when you're in a quiet place, whether you're, you know, going to bed at night or waking up in the morning, and you're just, you know, with your eyes closed, and you start seeing what you want to achieve. And for athletes, it's seeing themselves, you know, shooting the basket, you know, from beyond the three-point line, let's say, if they're, you know, a long-range shooter, or a hockey player, you know, making the goal. Whatever that is that you want to do, you see yourself, and it's like you play a movie, like you're seeing yourself in a film that you're playing in your mind. And when you do that, that's the visualization. Something happens, we don't understand what, in the subconscious, but it does increase the ability that athletes are going to be able to achieve that. But also, it's not only something that athletes can use. You can use it in business or anything else you want. In fact, there's a classic book, Think and Grow Rich, that talks about visualization as well, based on a lot of the most successful business people in the era when the book was written and published, that used the same type of visualization technique too. So we discuss that and sort of explain how the everyday person can use that to achieve more success in whatever they want.
You know, it's certainly a fascinating book, and there were so many ways we could have talked about this book and covered it, but, you know, just kind of getting to the basics of knowing, why do I make the decisions that I make? To catch yourself, you know, is this being impulsive, or is this something that's genuine? I mean, there are a lot of ways that you can begin to, I guess, cultivate the seeds in yourself so that you can increase your perceptual intelligence. And as you were saying earlier in the program, you know, life will get a little bit easier and things will start happening for you the way you would like them to, and you won't find yourself in such frustration. Not that we won't have frustration, but we certainly will manage it quite a bit easier.
And it's all about trying to help people. That's what, I mean, as a doctor, I became a doctor to help people, and the book is an extension of that desire to help people with understanding and making better decisions in their life. And you know, we didn't really have time to talk about this, but, you know, the chapter that probably is the favorite chapter of virtually everybody is the chapter about sex, because that's one thing that cuts through demographics, age, socioeconomics. I mean, sex is one of the most important things in somebody's life, and there's so many issues people have with sex, with themselves and with their partners, and the book really helps people in a way that's, well, let's put it this way, it's an amazing chapter, and just, you know, do go and get the book now. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and essentially everywhere books are sold.
Well, I kind of thought I'd leave that one to you so they'd have their sex drive to get them there.
Perceptual intelligence.
Because if you remember, even in the book Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill talks about that very thing, harnessing the power of your sexual desire, your drive, you know, to go after success, and it's pretty powerful stuff. So
yeah, and it doesn't get a lot of play in the way to try to help people. So that's why, you know, when you think of your own perceptions about sex, with, you know, yourself and with your partner, a lot of people have issues, and the book helps to unlock that and sort of enhance your mastery of the perceptions of sex and in ways that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise without the information in the book.
Well, very good. Dr. Brian, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program to talk about your book, Perceptual Intelligence. And then there are also people who are in midlife can come to understand why time seems to go by so much faster than it did when we were in our youths. Again, like I said, there were so many ways we could have went with this, but it was a lot of fun having you here on the program today. Thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure. And again, like I said, the book's available. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. So do go get it now.
Absolutely. You'll have a lot of fun reading it, I'm telling you. It's definitely a coffee table book. So, Brian, thank you so much for being on the program today.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Take your perceptual intelligence and go to beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.